My name is Emily Hart, and I am 28 years old, and the table was set for 11 people the night my father stood up with his water glass in his hand and asked if he could say something before we ate. I want to tell you that in my family, in the years I am about to describe to you, nobody ever stood up at a table and asked to say something without somebody else's stomach dropping. That is what a toast had come to mean in our house. But this time my father looked at me first, not at my brother, not at the room, at me, and he said, "Before I say grace, I want to say something to my daughter." I had not heard him call it grace out loud in longer than I could remember. I had not heard him ask if he could say something to me, specifically, in front of everyone, without an edge in his voice, in 6 years. I did not know yet, on the night this story is really about to begin, that it would take a fire in a warehouse, a heart that stopped for almost a full minute in an ambulance, and a leather ledger that belonged to a man none of us had properly grieved, to get my father to that water glass and that sentence. I only knew, sitting at that table watching him find the words, that I had waited a long time to hear them, and that I was not going to rush him. But if you have ever been the one in your family who believed something the rest of them did not understand, and watched the ground shift under you because of it, this story is for you. If somebody you love ever looked at your faith like it was a liability instead of a comfort, stay with me, because I promise you it does not have to end where it started. Before I tell you how we got to that table, hit subscribe, because we tell stories like this every week, about families that took the long way back to each other, and this one took longer than most. I am the youngest of 3 children born into a family that had, by the time I came along, already stopped talking about God at the dinner table for 2 generations. My grandfather built the company from a single workshop behind his house into a furniture manufacturing business that by the time I was a teenager supplied office furniture and hotel lobby pieces to clients across 4 states. My father took it over when I was in high school and made it bigger and cleaner and more modern than my grandfather ever had. The kind of company that photographed well in a business magazine. The kind of company where nobody talked about anything that could not be put in a spreadsheet. We grew up outside a mid-size Ohio city, close enough to Columbus that my father drove in for client meetings every week, far enough out that our town still had the kind of main street where the hardware store owner knew your name. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees that turned a deep red every October, the kind of neighborhood built for families who had done well but did not need to announce it, and the company itself sat on the edge of town in a long, low brick building with our family name in plain white letters above the entrance, the same building my grandfather had expanded twice with his own hands before either of my parents were born. I grew up in a house that was warm in every way except the one that mattered most to me later. We had Christmas trees and birthday cakes and a mother who remembered everyone's coffee order without being told. What we did not have was a Bible anywhere I ever saw, or a single conversation at that table about anything beyond who had a game on Saturday and how the fourth quarter numbers were shaping up. My faith did not arrive the way people sometimes imagine, a crisis, a rock bottom, a dramatic collapse. It arrived slowly, in college, through a roommate named Sarah who invited me to a small church near campus, more times than I said yes, until one night I finally went, mostly to be polite, and sat in the back row of a room that smelled like coffee and old carpet, and felt something in me go quiet for the first time in years. I did not tell my family right away. I kept it small and private for almost a full year, going to church on Sunday mornings while I was home for a weekend, telling my mother I was meeting a friend for brunch. I read a little worn paperback Bible that Sarah gave me, tucked inside my desk drawer at my apartment, the way some people hide things they are ashamed of. Except I was not ashamed. I was just not ready yet for the room to go quiet, the way I already suspected it would. Sarah used to say that faith either becomes the thing you build a life around, or the thing you keep in a drawer. And for a while I tried to do both at once, going to the early service so I could still make it to brunch with my college friends by 10, sliding my Bible under a sweater whenever my roommate had people over. answering yes when someone asked if I was free on Sunday, and letting them assume I meant free for anything but church. I was not lying, not exactly. I was just buying myself time, the way you do when you suspect the truth is going to cost you something and you are not ready yet to pay it. What surprised me most in that first year was not the faith itself, it was how ordinary it felt from the inside. Nobody in that little church asked me to change everything about my life overnight. Nobody handed me a list of rules. An older woman named Ruth, who I would come to know much better later, simply sat next to me on my third Sunday and told me that most people spend their whole lives waiting to feel ready before they let God into the parts of their life that are the hardest to explain to their family, and that waiting was, in her experience, mostly a way of postponing the thing you already knew you needed to do. I thought about my father a great deal in that first year, more than I let on to anyone, including myself. I knew, even before I said a word to him, exactly what his face was going to do when I finally told him. I had watched that face do the same careful, controlled thing my whole life. Whenever a client threatened to walk, whenever a shipment came in wrong, whenever something happened that he could not immediately fix with a phone call and a spreadsheet. I did not know yet that faith, unlike a shipment or a client, was not a problem he was going to be able to fix at all, and that not being able to fix it was going to be harder on him than almost anything else in his life. There was one object from that first year I want you to remember, because it comes back later, transformed, in a way I could not have imagined at the time. My grandfather, before he died when I was 12, had kept a leather ledger, not for the company books, those were kept separately, but a private one, worn soft at the corners, where he wrote small notes to himself about the business, and, tucked into the very last page, a single handwritten line from an old hymn he must have loved as a young man. Nobody in the family ever looked at that ledger much after he died. It sat in a box in my father's office closet, unopened for years. I did not think about it again until the very end of this story, but I want you to hold on to the fact that it existed, quietly, in a box, the whole time everything else was falling apart. I finally told my family on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, at my mother's request that we all come for lunch. My brother Mark and his wife, my sister Claire, and my parents gathered around the same table where, 6 years later, my father would stand up with his water glass. I had meant to slip it into conversation gently. Instead, my mother asked, almost offhand, whether I wanted to come to the country club with them next Sunday, and I said I could not, because I went to church now, on Sunday mornings, and I had for almost a year. The table went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone is recalculating something at once. My sister asked which church, in a tone that made it clear the answer would matter more than she was pretending. My brother said nothing at all, which from Mark was its own kind of statement. My mother reached for her water glass and did not drink from it. My father set his fork down, carefully, the way he set things down when he was deciding how much to say. He asked me if this was serious or if it was a phase, and when I told him it was not a phase, he said, in a voice that was not loud but was very flat, that he hoped I understood what people would think, that a heart who talked about God in public was not the image the company had spent 30 years building, that our clients were not paying us to wonder if the family running their furniture contracts had lost their minds. I told him nobody at the office needed to know anything about my Sunday mornings. He looked at me for a long moment and said that was not really the point. And he was right, though I did not understand yet what the real point was. I did not know yet that this exact lunch, this exact sentence about what people would think, would be the one my father brought up again years later, in a hospital hallway, as the moment he was most ashamed of in the entire 6 years between. That lunch ended early. Nobody raised their voice. My mother made coffee nobody drank. My father went into his office and closed the door, the way he did when a client call had gone badly, and I drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel, wondering if I had just done something I could not undo. The exclusion did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way water finds the low places in a floor, quietly, over months, until you realize the whole house has shifted. It started with the company. I had worked part-time in the marketing department since college, helping with the client photography and the catalog copy, half a career and half a family obligation, and I had always assumed that eventually I would move into something bigger there, the way my brother had. That spring, a director position opened that everyone had always assumed would be mine. My father gave it to a young man from outside the family instead, and when I asked him about it directly, he told me, without quite looking at me, that clients needed to feel like the people running their accounts had their priorities straight, and left it there. I was not invited to the annual client dinner that winter, the one I had gone to every year since I was 22. When I asked my mother about it, she said, gently, that my father thought it might be easier for everyone if I sat this one out, this year, given everything. My brother Mark, who had never been unkind to me exactly, started including me a little less in the ordinary conversations that used to just happen, the group texts about a game, the casual invitations to stop by after work. Nothing dramatic, just a slow erosion of the assumption that I was still fully one of them. My sister Claire was the one who said the quiet part out loud, once, at a family barbecue, half joking, in front of my aunt and uncle, that Emily had gotten religion, and now none of us were allowed to say a bad word without her praying for our souls. Everyone laughed, the easy laugh people use to cover an awkward truth. And I laughed too, because what else do you do at a barbecue? And I went inside afterward and cried in my mother's bathroom for longer than I meant to. There was a period, about 8 months in, when my father asked a family friend from church he barely knew, a man named Doug who attended a large non-denominational congregation across town purely for the networking, to have lunch with me and, in his words, help me understand how a person balances personal beliefs with professional appearances. Doug turned out to be kind and completely unhelpful for my father's purposes, because he spent most of the lunch telling me about his own quiet faith and how he had never once mentioned it at his own company in 15 years and did not see why anyone should have to. I liked Doug. My father never brought him up again. Around that same time, my father sat down with a lawyer, a fact I did not learn until my mother let it slip almost a year later, on a night she had had a little too much wine at her own book club and needed somewhere to put the guilt she had been carrying. She told me, quietly, in her kitchen, that my father had asked the family attorney to draft language into the estate plan that would let him adjust each child's share individually, rather than splitting everything 3 equal ways, the way the old plan had always read. Nobody used the word disinherit out loud, not even my mother, not even that night. She just told me the plan had changed and that she had argued against it, and lost, and had never forgiven herself for not arguing harder. I did not confront my father about it. I did not even fully believe, at first, that it was really about me, though some quiet, honest part of me knew exactly what it was about. I went home that night and sat on my apartment floor for a long time, not crying, just sitting, turning over the strange, cold fact that the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the house I grew up in had apparently decided, somewhere in a lawyer's office, that my faith in God made me a financial risk to plan around. I told Sarah about it the next week, over coffee, and she asked me the question that ended up staying with me longer than almost anything else anyone said to me during those 6 years. She asked whether I was more upset about the money or about what the money meant, and I sat with that question for a long time before I understood that it was never really the money. It was the fact that my own father had looked at the whole of who I had become and decided the safest thing to do was to plan for my faith the way you plan for a flood or a fire, as a risk to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. There was one particular board meeting, near the end of the 2nd year, that I still think about more than almost any other single moment from that stretch. My father had scheduled a strategy session with the small group of family members and senior managers who sat on the company's informal board, and I found out about it only because my brother mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew. When I asked my father about it directly, he told me, without much apology in his voice, that he had thought it made more sense to keep the group smaller this time, and that he did not think my particular perspective was needed for a conversation about long-term client strategy. I did not argue. I went home that evening and sat with the quiet, specific hurt of being told, in careful business language, that my presence in a room full of my own family was optional in a way nobody else's was. Through all of it, I kept going to church on Sunday mornings. I kept reading the little worn paperback Bible Sarah had given me, now marked up in 3 colors of ink. I never once brought up faith at a family dinner unless someone else did first, and when someone did, I answered as briefly and as calmly as I could and let the subject change. I was not trying to prove anything to anyone. I did not yet know that not trying to prove anything was the exact thing that would eventually matter most. If any of this sounds familiar, if you have ever had to keep showing up to a family that had quietly started treating you like a stranger, tell me in the comments how long it lasted for you, because for us this was only the first year of 6. The low point came at Thanksgiving, 2 years into all of it, at a table crowded with cousins and aunts and uncles who did not know the full shape of what had been happening in our house. My uncle, my father's younger brother, a kind but careless man, asked me across the table, mostly to make conversation, whether I still went to that little church of mine, and before I could answer, my father said, without looking up from carving the turkey, that I did, religiously, and let the words sit there in the air, the way a word can sit when it is meant to cut. The table laughed, the same easy laugh from the barbecue, and I felt my face go hot, and my mother's hand found my knee under the table, a small pressure that meant, I know, I am sorry, please do not say anything. I did not say anything. I finished my plate, helped clear the dishes, and drove home that night and called my friend Sarah from the parking lot of my apartment building before I even went inside, because I did not think I could hold it together through the front door. I told her I did not know how much longer I could keep doing this, showing up to be quietly humiliated at every family gathering, watching my brother get folded further into the company while I got folded out of it, wondering if my father was ever going to look at me the way he used to. I told her I was tired of being patient, and that patience was starting to feel less like a virtue and more like something being done to me. Sarah did not tell me to fight back, and she did not tell me to walk away either. She reminded me, gently, that the whole shape of a life like this one is measured in years, not in single dinners, and that the version of me who kept showing up quietly was not weak. She was the only version of me my father had never actually met, and that eventually, one way or another, he would. I did not believe her that night. I believed her later. I want to pause here and tell you about the third call to action, because if you are anywhere near the low point of your own version of this story, I do not want you to scroll past this without hearing it. Have you ever had to keep loving someone through a season where they doubted your faith, doubted your judgment, maybe even doubted you? Tell me about that season in the comments, because I promise you, whoever is watching this tonight, you are not the only one sitting in a parking lot after a family dinner wondering if it is ever going to get better. The weeks after that Thanksgiving were some of the loneliest of my whole life, in a way that is strange to describe, because on paper nothing dramatic had happened. I still had my apartment, my job, my church, my Thursday nights with Ruth and the widow's meals and the children's classroom on Sunday mornings. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by your own blood and still feeling like a guest in the room, and that winter I felt it every single time I walked into my parents' house. My mother tried, in her own limited way, to bridge the gap. She would call me sometimes just to talk, careful never to mention church directly, asking instead about my week, my friends, whether I was eating enough, the small maternal questions that meant she had not given up on me even if she could not fully stand beside me either. I loved her for those calls even while I understood exactly how much they were costing her to make, without ever once defending me openly to my father. The years that followed had a shape to them that is hard to explain, except to say that time moved, and I kept living the same way inside it. I kept my part-time work at the company, though I never got another chance at advancement. I found a small apartment near my church and became, slowly, someone who was known there, someone who helped with the children's classroom on Sunday mornings, who brought meals to a widow in the congregation named Ruth for almost 2 years after her husband passed, who was asked, eventually, to lead a small group of young women through a weekly Bible study on Thursday nights. My brother Mark, in those years, started to soften in small ways that surprised me. He would sometimes text me after a hard week at the company, not about faith, just about life, the way brothers do when they trust each other again by accident. Once, at a cousin's wedding, he pulled me aside and told me he did not understand my faith and probably never would, but that he had noticed I was the same person at every family event, whether things were good or bad, and that had started to mean something to him, even if he could not explain exactly what. My father, though, held the line. He was not cruel in those years, not exactly. He was simply careful, the way you are careful around something you have decided is a risk. He asked after my job, my apartment, my health, and never once asked about my church, my Thursday night group, or the growing quiet center of my life that had, by then, become the steadiest thing I owned. Christmas, across those middle years, became the holiday I measured everything by, the way some families measure time and birthdays. The first Christmas after I told them was stiff and careful, everyone talking a little too brightly about nothing in particular. The second, my father found a reason to leave the room when I mentioned, in passing, a service I had gone to that week. By the third, something had softened just slightly, enough that my mother started leaving a chair open near her at the table without anyone having to ask, and by the fourth, my brother's wife began quietly including me again in the small talk that had once excluded me without anyone noticing it happening. None of it was dramatic, none of it on its own would have made a good scene in a story. But 4 Christmases of small, unremarkable shifts were exactly what 6 years of change actually looked like from the inside, long before anything as loud as a fire or a hospital room ever entered the picture. There is a phrase my father used often in those years, at the company and at home, that Hart family does not do things halfway. He meant it, in those days, as a small dig at me, an implication that my faith was a halfway kind of thing, a hobby dressed up as a conviction. I heard him say it more than once in a tone that made clear who he was thinking about when he said it. I want you to remember that phrase too, the way I asked you to remember the leather ledger, because it comes back, later, meaning something entirely different. There was a small object in those middle years that I have not mentioned yet, and I want to tell you about it now, because it turned out to matter more than I understood at the time. Ruth, the widow from church I had been bringing meals to since almost the beginning, gave me her late husband's pocket cross on a thin silver chain not long after he passed, and told me she wanted someone who would actually wear it, rather than let it sit in a drawer the way so many inherited things do. I wore it under my shirt to every family dinner for the next 3 years, not to make a statement, simply because it had become, quietly, mine. My mother noticed it once, early on, and asked where it came from, and when I told her, she reached out and held it between 2 fingers for a moment, the way you hold something that reminds you of a version of your daughter you had not fully let yourself see yet, and then let it go and did not mention it again for a long while. I also want to tell you about a Thursday night group I mentioned earlier, because those young women became, over those years, something closer to a second family than I expected when I first agreed to lead them. We met in my small apartment living room, 6 or 7 of us most weeks, working slowly through scripture and through whatever hard week someone was carrying. I never once told them the details of what was happening at my own family's table. I did not think it was their burden to carry. But I think, looking back, that room was where I quietly practiced the version of faith my father would eventually witness, without ever knowing he was watching it happen in miniature, every single Thursday, for years, before the crisis that finally opened his eyes. Around the 4th year, the company began to struggle in ways that were not yet visible to anyone outside the family. A large hotel chain that had been our biggest client for over a decade restructured its supply contracts and moved most of its business elsewhere. My father, who had built his identity almost entirely around the company's steady growth, took the loss harder than he let anyone see, and started making decisions under pressure that were not always his best ones. It is the second call to action of this video, and I want to ask you something before I keep going. Has anyone in your family ever needed years, real years, not weeks, to finally come around to accepting who you were? Tell me how long it took, and whether you are still waiting, because I read every single comment on these stories, and I promise you are not the only one still waiting. The company's troubles came to a head on a Tuesday night in late autumn, when an electrical fault in the main warehouse started a fire that burned through nearly a third of the building before the fire department got it under control. Nobody was hurt, which felt like the only mercy in the whole disaster. But the inventory loss and the insurance dispute that followed put the company in a position it had never been in before, close enough to real financial danger that my father stopped sleeping and started making phone calls at hours that worried my mother. I heard about the fire from my mother, not from him, in a short, shaking phone call the night it happened. I drove to the warehouse before I even thought about whether I would be welcome there, and stood in the parking lot in the cold with my father and my brother and a dozen employees, watching the last of the smoke rise off a building that had employed people from our town for 2 generations. My father did not ask me to leave. He did not say much of anything to me at all that night. But I noticed, standing there, that he did not send me away either, and for the first time in years that felt like something. Over the weeks that followed, the company entered what I can only describe as a slow, grinding crisis, the kind that does not announce itself with a single dramatic headline, but instead arrives as 100 small emergencies stacked one on top of another. The insurance adjusters disputed the value of the lost inventory. A regional bank that had extended a line of credit years earlier grew nervous and began asking questions my father did not have comfortable answers for. 2 more clients, spooked by rumors about the fire, quietly moved their contracts elsewhere before the year was even out. My father, who had spent his whole life being the steadiest person in any room, started arriving at the office before dawn and leaving well after dark, running on coffee and a kind of grim determination that worried my mother more than she ever said to him directly. I found myself, almost without deciding to, spending more and more evenings at the office during that stretch. At first just helping sort through the insurance paperwork because nobody else had time, and then gradually taking on more, drafting client letters, sitting in on calls with the bank, doing the quiet, unglamorous work that nobody else particularly wanted. I never asked for a title. I never mentioned the estate plan my mother had told me about, though it sat in the back of my mind on more nights than I would like to admit. I simply worked, the way I had worked at everything else for 6 years, because the company had my grandfather's name on the building, and it needed doing, and I happened to be the one available to do it. I do not remember my father ever missing a day of work in his life before that winter, and I think that is part of what made what happened next so frightening to all of us, because a man like that does not know how to slow down even when his own body is telling him to. 3 weeks after the fire, in the middle of a meeting with the insurance adjusters, my father collapsed at the conference table. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, his heart had stopped for nearly a full minute, and it took the emergency room team longer than anyone standing in that waiting room wanted to hear before they told us he was stable. I was already there when they let us in to see him, because I had come straight from work the moment my mother called, before I even knew how serious it was. My brother and sister arrived not long after, but for the first 2 hours, before the rest of the family made it through traffic and disbelief, it was mostly me, sitting in a plastic chair beside a bed with too many wires running out of it, praying quietly, the way I had prayed at Ruth's bedside 100 times before, not performing it, not saying it loudly enough for anyone to hear, just holding his hand and asking God to let him wake up whole. He did wake up, groggy and confused, sometime after 4 in the morning, and the first face he saw clearly, once his eyes focused, was mine. He did not say anything about it that night. He was too tired, too frightened himself, still tangled in wires and the strange humility that comes over even the strongest people in a hospital bed. But I stayed until the sun came up, and I was still there the next afternoon when he woke again, more alert this time, and found me reading quietly in the chair beside him, and he asked, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from him, whether I had been there the whole time. I told him I had. He did not say anything else for a long while. He just looked at me, the way you look at something you thought you understood, and are suddenly not sure you did. I did not know that night that this was the moment he would later describe, weeks afterward, as the one he could not stop turning over in his mind, sitting alone in that hospital room in the hours I was not there, wondering why the daughter he had spent 6 years quietly pushing to the margins of his life was the one who never left. The company survived in the end, though not easily. It took my mother, my brother, and eventually me, working evenings and weekends for months, going through the insurance claims and the rebuilding contracts and the anxious calls with remaining clients to get Hart Furnishings back onto stable ground. I did not ask for a title, I did not ask for a raise or a seat at the table or an acknowledgement of any kind. I simply worked, the way I had worked at everything for 6 years, quietly and without an agenda, because it was my family and my grandfather's name still on the building, and it needed doing. It was during that rebuilding, going through boxes of old records in my father's office closet to find some archived client files, that I found the leather ledger again, the one that had belonged to my grandfather, sitting exactly where it had sat for 16 years, gathering dust in the same box. I opened it, mostly out of curiosity, and found his small, careful handwriting filling page after page of old notes about the business. And there, on the very last page, the single line from the hymn I had half remembered him humming when I was small, written in his own hand in ink gone brown with age. I did not show it to anyone right away. I set it on the corner of my father's desk before I left that night, without a note, and went home. This is the fourth call to action, and it comes right before I tell you what happened next. So let me ask you this. Did someone in your life ever finally say the words, "I was wrong" to you, after years of silence, and what did that feel like when it finally came? I want to know, because what happened next in my family took me completely by surprise, even after everything. My father called me 2 days later and asked if I would come by the house that Sunday evening, alone, before the rest of the family arrived for dinner. I found him sitting at the kitchen table with the leather ledger open in front of him, and the little worn paperback Bible I had left at his hospital bedside without thinking, that he must have kept, sitting beside it. He asked me to sit down, and for a long moment he did not say anything at all, just looked at the ledger, running his thumb along the edge of the worn page, the way you touch something you are afraid might not be real. Then he said, plainly, without any of the careful distance he usually kept, that he had been wrong. He said he had spent 6 years believing that my faith was a soft spot in me, a liability, something that would make people think less of the company and less of me, and that he had been so afraid of what other people would think that he had never once stopped to actually look at what my faith was doing to my life, right in front of him, the whole time. He said he remembered the exact lunch, 6 years earlier, where he told me I did not understand what people would think, and that he had thought about that sentence more times in the 3 weeks since his heart stopped than he cared to admit, because the person who never once left his hospital room, who never asked for anything, who was still there every single day while half the family cycled in and out around their own schedules, was the daughter he had spent 6 years quietly deciding was a problem to be managed. He said he had found his own father's handwriting in that ledger for the first time in 16 years because of me, and that he did not even remember his father as a religious man. Not really, but that finding that one line, tucked in the back of a book my father had kept without ever really opening, made him wonder how much of his own life he had spent avoiding a version of himself he never gave a chance to exist. He said the words plainly, the way the apology is supposed to be said, not wrapped in an excuse. I told people, in 100 small ways for 6 years, that your faith made you less trustworthy, less serious, less mine somehow, and I was the one who was wrong, the whole time, and I am asking you to forgive me. I told him I already had. I told him I had forgiven him a long time ago, in pieces, on the nights when it was hardest, because staying angry at him would have cost me more than it ever cost him, and that I was not telling him that to make him feel better, I was telling him because it was true. He put his head down on the table then. My father, a man I had never once seen cry in 28 years, and I sat with him at that kitchen table and let him, and did not say a word about "I told you so," because that was never what any of this had been about. We sat there for a long while after that, neither of us saying much, the leather ledger still open between us on the table. Eventually, he asked me, quietly, whether I had ever thought about giving up, whether there had been a night, in 6 years of Sunday mornings and quiet dinners, and every family gathering where he had let me be treated as slightly less than everyone else at the table, when I had considered simply walking away from the family the way it would have been so easy to do. I told him the truth, that there had been more than one night like that, the parking lot after Thanksgiving among the worst of them, but that walking away would have meant giving up on the version of him I still believed was in there somewhere, and I was not willing to do that, not for him, and not for myself either. He asked me, almost like a child asking a question he was afraid was foolish, what it actually felt like, the faith itself, on an ordinary Tuesday with nothing wrong, and I told him honestly that most of the time it did not feel like anything dramatic at all. It felt like a kind of steadiness, underneath everything else, the same way a foundation does not announce itself on a normal day. You only notice it is there when the ground around it starts to shake. The months after that apology were not a straight line back to easy. My father did not become a man who talked about faith at every dinner, and I did not expect him to. What changed was smaller and steadier than that. He started asking, sometimes, what my Thursday night group had studied that week, not performing interest, just curious. He came to a Christmas Eve service with me that first winter, sat in the back row, the way I once had, and did not say much afterward except that the music had been nicer than he expected. He gave me back a real role at the company that spring, not as a consolation, he was careful to make that clear, but because the insurance adjusters and the bank had both told him, separately, that the person who had steadied the company through the fire and the recovery had been me, and he was done pretending otherwise to save face with anyone. My mother, who had spent 6 years trying quietly to keep the peace at every table, told me once that she had prayed for this exact outcome longer than she had ever told me, in her own private way, even though she had never gone to church a day in her life. I did not know what to do with that, except to hug her for a long time in her kitchen and not ask any more questions than she wanted to answer. That spring, my father did something I did not expect at all. He asked me to walk him through the little worn paperback Bible he had kept from the hospital, not because he was ready to call himself a believer, he was careful to say that plainly, but because he wanted to understand the thing that had apparently outlasted every argument he had made against it. We sat at his kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, the two of us, and I read him a few of the passages I had underlined years earlier without ever imagining he would ask to hear them, and he listened the way he used to listen to a difficult client, carefully, taking his time before he responded, and at the end he told me he still did not understand all of it, but that he understood, finally, why I had never been willing to trade it for his approval. My aunt and uncle, the same ones who had laughed at the Thanksgiving table 2 years earlier without knowing what they were laughing at, noticed the change before most of the extended family did. My uncle pulled me aside at a cookout that summer and told me, a little sheepishly, that he had heard from my father what the last 2 years had actually looked like from the inside, and that he was sorry for the joke he had made without ever asking me a single real question about my life. I told him it was all right. I meant it, mostly, though it took me a little longer than I let on to fully believe it. My brother Mark started coming to church with me occasionally, not every week, not out of any dramatic conversion, just because he said he liked how quiet the room felt, and because he wanted to understand the thing that had apparently outlasted 6 years of our father's resistance. My sister Claire never came at all, and never fully stopped teasing me a little, gently now instead of sharply, and that was fine. Nobody in this story converted to anything. That was never the point. We are gathered around that same table now, most Sundays, the way we did not for 6 long years, and every single person at it is still exactly who they were before, in their own faith or their own lack of one. My father still runs the company, though he brought me on formally as a director last year, the title I once thought I had lost for good. He still, once in a while, catches himself starting to worry aloud about what a client might think of something, and then stops himself, and laughs a little at his own habit, and moves on. He still says, sometimes, that Hart Family does not do things halfway, except now, when he says it, He is usually looking at me, and he means it as the highest compliment he knows how to give. Doug, the man my father once sent to talk sense into me, came to that same dinner not long ago, invited this time by my father himself, rather than sent as a quiet correction. The two of them sat together on the back porch afterward for the better part of an hour, and when I asked my father later what they had talked about, he told me, a little embarrassed, that he had wanted to ask Doug how a person keeps their faith quiet for 15 years at the same company without ever once being asked to defend it, because he was still trying to understand what it had cost me, and what it had cost him, to have spent 6 years assuming a version of that question that was never true in the first place. He has still never once, to this day, said a formal prayer of his own at a family dinner. He lets me do it, most weeks, and stands there with his head bowed and his eyes open just a little, watching the table the way a man watches something he is still, gently, learning to trust. Nobody minds. My mother says it is more honest this way than if he had faked it all along, and I think she is right, because a perfect ending would not feel like ours, and ours is not perfect. It is just real, and it is ours. That leather ledger sits on a shelf in my father's office now, not in a closet, in plain sight, next to a framed photo of my grandfather standing in front of the original workshop. My little worn paperback Bible sits on my own desk 2 doors down the hall, in an office with my name on it, finally. If I had to boil 6 years down to one sentence, it would be this. Love does not need to win an argument to eventually be believed. It only needs to keep showing up long enough for fear to run out of reasons. People sometimes ask me, in the comments on these stories, whether I ever wanted to just walk away from all of it. The company, the family, the whole complicated weight of a name above a factory door. I did, some nights. But I think what kept me at that table, year after year, was never really about the company or even about being believed. It was about refusing to let someone else's fear decide who I was allowed to become, and about trusting, quietly and without proof, for a very long time, that love that is real does not need to be argued into existence. It only needs enough time to finally be seen. So let me ask you the same question I always end with, because I want to know your answer. Has your family ever come around, fully, after years of standing on the other side of something you believed? Tell me in the comments how long it took, and if you are still waiting for that table to feel whole again, I am praying it comes sooner than 6 years. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If it meant something to you, hit subscribe, because there is another family and another long table waiting in next week's story.